Chapter 11 of Tractate Shabbos begins by discussing some laws of throwing items between domains. The Mishnah begins by saying that if you throw an object from a private domain to a public domain, or vice versa, you're liable. If you throw the item from a private domain to a private domain with a public domain in between, Rabbi Akiva says you're liable, the rabbis say you're exempt. Specifically, if you have two balconies, both private domains, one opposite the other, you're allowed to pass or throw stuff between them. But if the balconies are on the same side, you can throw stuff, but you can't pass stuff between the balconies, because that's considered similar to how the Levium worked by the tabernacle, handing boards back and forth between the wagons lined up along the length of the public property, but not throwing them. The Gemara brings the source for the prohibition against carrying, which was Moshe standing in the Levite camp, which was a public domain, and telling people not to bring anything in. And we know this was a Shabbos from a linkage of words towards Yom Kippur, implying this is a day without work, being Shabbos. That's the law of taking stuff out. Logically, based on that, you wouldn't be allowed to bring anything in either. This is discussed further, and if parts constitute primary labors or subcategories. We know throwing things is an issue after some discussion, as maybe the source is from the sewers of the curtains by the tabernacle throwing needles to each other, but no, they would be sitting within 4 amos cubits of each other, which is smaller than the minimum amount you can't throw. We try to learn it's from the weavers throwing the shuttle back and forth, but there are issues with that, so in the end it's just a tradition passed down from Sinai. During the wandering in the desert, there was a famous incident where one person violated Shabbos and was put to death. He took a bunch of wood. Some say he violated the law of carrying, some say it was reaping, and others say it was gathering. We know from an earlier mentioned topic that there's an opinion that one of the 39 forms of work does not have the death penalty for its violation, so this rules out these 3, according to their respective opinions. The person who did this in the desert was named Salafchad. This was learned from a source. It also discusses leprosy, which could be caused by suspecting others of misdeeds. We also see by Moshe having his hands get leprosy, it healed faster than it contracted the disease, meaning God gives healing faster than a punishment. It also says that when Aaron's staff swallowed the Egyptian magician's staffs, there was a miracle within a miracle. Back to the debate about throwing the object from private domain to private domain. Possibly both would hold he's exempt if the item is thrown over 10 handbreadths, as that's the maximum height of a public domain, or maybe they actually do argue based on if they hold we learn throwing things from the laws of handing over, while holding if it's within the domain that they're both definitely liable. So based on a proof, it's the former argument. We don't learn about throwing things from handing things over, and if the object is above 10 handbreadths, it's allowed according to both of them. Others, of course, argue with this. There's another case of throwing an item from public property to public property over a private property, where there's an argument if you're liable or exempt. Some say that the opinion that he's liable is only where the private property is roofed, and others say that he's actually liable for 2 violations of bringing an item out and bringing an item in. There's lengthy argument on this, and also in the case of if you throw an object at a different distance than you intended. Some say it's fine to carry in a public domain that's roofed, as that's not comparable to the carrying in the desert. Others disagree, saying the areas around and beneath the wagons in the desert is like a roofed public domain, so there's lengthy argument to determine the exact dimensions of the wagons to figure out if they would have been viable for such a domain. The answer brought is that the wagons didn't really have floors, it was more 2-wheeled sides connected with wide pegs. This gets into a bit of a longer point about the exact dimensions of many of the boards and structure in the tabernacle, and how the cloths draped over them. It further discusses the dimensions of the wagons. New Mishnah. If you have a pile of dirt by a pit or a rock in a public domain that are 4 handbreadths wide and 10 handbreadths tall, that's considered a private domain, so you can't place or remove objects from it. If it's smaller than this minimum, it's obviously fine. The Gemara says that it says a pile of dirt by a pit as opposed to just a pit, to show that the depth of the pit and the height of the pile can combine to form 10 handbreadths. There's discussion on the case of throwing an item on top of a post with these dimensions. This case is where the thrown object never enters the exempt airspace above the public domain, as there's a protrusion or a crevice, so the thrown object, which is very small, like a needle, never enters above the public domain. A similar question, what if there's a wall 10 handbreadths high that surrounds a carmelis, a neutral area, thus turning it into a private domain, but the wall is thinner than 4 handbreadths? It's considered to be a private domain as it turns the carmelis into a private property, so also for itself. There's a case discussed of having a 9 handbreadths pit that you dig a piece out to make it 10. You're carrying at the same time the pit becomes a private domain, so is that an issue? There's a similar case of throwing a board on top of pegs that are 10 cubits in the air. That one stands unresolved. It also brings the case discussed way earlier about a nut in a vessel floating on water. Is the nut at rest from the vessel or not? Is it not at rest because it's in water? So that stands unresolved. There's also that dispute about oil on wine, if they're considered connected or not. There's also a case of an 8x10 pit which is obviously problematic if you throw a mat inside. But if you throw the mat inside vertically, so it lands cutting the pit in half, so it's no longer landing in a private domain, you'd be exempt. Some disagree. If a private domain pit is filled with water, it makes no difference, but filling it with produce does, and it's no longer considered a private domain, and there's a source brought. New Mishnah. If you throw an object into a public domain at a wall, if it hits the wall above 10 handbreadths, you're exempt. If it's below, you're liable. It's as if it's on the ground, which is not allowed. The Gemara says this is a case of something that's sticking to the wall, so that it's not bouncing back and becoming less than the minimum 4 cubits that you can't throw. There's disagreement if it lands in a crevice in a wall, based on what you hold in that regard. There's also a point on that you're liable if you throw something on a mound 10 handbreadths by 4 cubits, 4 being the slope of the mound. New Mishnah. If you throw an object less than 4 cubits, but the wind blows it further than 4, you're exempt. If you throw it over 4, and the wind blows it back to you, you're liable. The Gemara says that the issue with the second case is that it stayed over 4 cubits for a brief instant. Some require the item to be within 3 cubits of the ground for it to be considered at rest. New Mishnah. Throwing an object 4 cubits into the sea makes you exempt. A shallow pool of water less than 10 handbreadths in a public domain makes you liable. It then repeats this. The Gemara says that it repeats this twice about a passage to teach inconvenient passage is considered a passage, but inconvenient usage is not considered usage, and does not make an area considered a public domain. It repeats the point on a pool, according to one to teach that a shallow pool is considered a public domain in the winter and summer, so when people aren't cooling themselves and when it's muddy, or it's to include a pool 4 cubits wide or 4 cubits long that people walk around or step around as a public domain. This is applied to other cases. New Mishnah. If you throw something from a sea to dry land, or vice versa, or from the sea to a ship, or vice versa, or from ship to ship, you're exempt. If the ships are tied together, you can carry stuff between, but if they're not tied, you can't carry stuff between the ships. The Gemara says that if you're on a ship and want a bucket of seawater, some say you should extend a rod to fill a bucket, as according to this opinion, the ocean is a Carmelis, but that only applies to the ocean bed, up to 10 handbreadths, so you can just pick the water up. However, you use the rod just as a reminder. The other opinion is that you need to make an enclosed area 4 handbreadths wide above the water and fill your bucket from there, as they hold that the whole ocean is a Carmelis from the water's surface. By the first opinion, there's no concern of the ship entering shallow water under 10 handbreadths because ships don't travel in water that shallow, and they have probers with poles to make sure of that. By the second opinion, you can pour your wastewater out of the ship by pouring it on the wall of the ship, and it's fine that it's your force as it's into a Carmelis, which is allowed in such circumstances. There's a proof brought. There are smaller boats that have exceptions and stricter rules. There's arguments on the point. You're also allowed to carry between ships tied together if there's a little boat wedged between. This is discussed further. New Mishnah. If you throw an object on Shabbos and after throwing it realize that it's Shabbos and another person catches it or a dog catches it or it burns, you're exempt. If you throw the object to inflict a wound and then realize it's Shabbos before it hits, you're exempt. Basically, the rule is that you're liable for a chatas offering if both the start and completion of the action was unintentional, but if one of those was intentional and the other was unintentional, then you're exempt. The Gemara argues as to what exactly the context of the cases of the Mishnah are. Some say the later cases are about an item tied to a rope, possibly to cause a wound, possibly to others. The case of throwing it into a dog's mouth or fire is where that's not your intent. If it was your intent, like a different case, it's considered like a significant target and may not be thrown at. This is discussed a bit further. And that's the end of chapter 11.